Well, now it's time for us to get into some protocols and some standards for testing. And so with that, we take a look at who sets the protocols and the standards for testing and for sampling. Well, the EPA does. And from there, you look at their guidebook, and their guidebook actually says the EPA does not regulate mold and mold spores in indoor air. Well, that's misinterpreted slightly in the sense that they don't set a benchmark. However, when you go to a state level, the state says they follow the EPA guidelines, but there isn't a lot written on it. So the EPA has some basic guidelines, and they do have their books for mold and mold in residential and commercial and schools. That gives us a basis to work with, but it certainly does not get down into the details of actually sampling. So then when we look at who do we turn to, we can take a look at used to be ESA as one of the players, ESA being Environmental Solutions Association. They no longer exist, and so the other options are IAQA, ACGIH, and their protocols of 19.5.3.1 is a common one that people refer to. And another one is ESO 1210 is used. And then Testall has now adopted a standard for testing, which uses these others as a support mechanism and a standard to go by. Let's take a look at the steps for testing mold. When you do test for mold, one of the first things you want to do is see what caused the water intrusion. Then you want to know what needs to be done to correct that. Upon following those items, the next thing you'll go to is what type of testing will you be doing? There must be some backing and some support as to why you are going to do sampling and how much. Then you'll have a testing agreement. That agreement is typically with your client as to what kind of testing and how many samples. And then you're going to go to mold sampling. What mold samples are you going to take? And what is the reason for taking those? I don't ever recommend taking a sample unless you are trying to prove or disprove something. That's the point to taking samples. Also, the interpretation of the lab report. So you take samples, you send them off to the lab, and get a lab report back. Then what do? Well, you need to be able to look at the lab report and make an interpretation. How does that fit in with what you saw on the site? A lot of inspectors have been going out and taking samples, send it off to the lab, and then the report comes back for the lab. They hand it to their client and say, here you go. The client looks at it, can't read it, it looks Greek to them, so they say, well, what does this mean? The inspector calmly says, I don't know, ask the lab. Well, the lab wasn't there. The lab doesn't know what was going on in the field. So you've handcuffed the lab, and although the lab tries really hard based on the results that they get to make some kind of interpretation, that's unfair to strap the lab with that procedure. So what we have done is we have taken the sampling protocols and we have taken the testing protocols and merged them together with building sciences to create the standard that we have today. And that is what caused the water intrusion, what needs to be done to correct that, what type of testing will you be doing, the mold samples that you're going to be taking, and the interpretation of the lab report. And this accumulative will create a report. And that's a report that both the client and the realtors can now use to do proper corrective action. So we take a look at this house here, standard house with some water intrusion. And you'll see this front photo is from standing up on a bit of a hill. So we now know that water going down the hill may end up against the house. However, if you look at it pretty carefully, you will see that there is a trench, if you will, that will skirt the water around the house. They are having a moisture problem and they are having a mold issue within the home. This home had been inspected. It was a home where a woman had inherited it from her parents living there and sold it, but the client buying it had a home inspection. The inspector said that there was a mold problem and it needed to be corrected. So that's when we get the call. We come to the job site, we identify that indeed it does look like there's a swale in the front of the house, but we already know since there's a mold problem, there's got to be some water there someplace. Let's see if we can figure it out. So we go to the basement, here's a finished room. You look at the finished room and it looks clean. The walls are clean, floor is clean, no water stains, nothing to indicate a mold problem. No efflorescence in between the floor tiles, looks good. Then we go to the unfinished portion. We take a look here, you'll see this column, a steel column, cement filled, where moisture is actually wicked up from underneath the concrete into the steel column and starting to pit or rot the column. This is a common phenomenon that occurs when the moisture does wick up into the columns. From there, it starts to render the column less effective to do its job, to carry the load it was intended to. So there is a structural component to it. But there's also an indicator here that there's a moisture issue. And when you look at the base of this column, you will see efflorescence around the bottom of it, and you can see both water stains and efflorescence on the floor around that column. When we look at the next photograph, we'll see pockets of moisture stains on the floor. No actual water stains to any of the area items such as walls and floors in this area. But we move further to the next photo and we see a wall with sheetrock that's got moisture stains on it, probably from wicking up, mold on it. We also look between the floor and the wall and you'll notice that a section of the floor has been cut out. And they put in a new drain system there and then put the concrete back on top. However, this sheetrock was put on top of that, so there's an indication that this problem is still occurring. Probably a high water table. When you look at the walls, you don't see any signs of water on the walls. It all seems to be coming up through the floor, an important distinction you need to learn to make. Then we go over to the corners. We do see in the corners that there is some staining indicating maybe the gutter leaders used to drain water down towards the footing area, but some of it would infiltrate the wall and floor area down in the corner. The home inspector picked up that there was mold on the ductwork. But when you look at this photo with the ductwork on it, you'll see that the ductwork is wrapped with asbestos wrap. Then there's mold that grew on top of it. Well, that becomes problematic. They had an asbestos person come in and they said they can't do anything with the asbestos because it's got mold on it. They brought a mold remediation person in and said, I can't touch it, it's got asbestos. Now what do you do? Well, fortunately today there are venues and there are ways in which to correct this problem and be able to remediate it without extracting the asbestos. Good thing we have that today. The next thing I want you to take a peek at is we go back to this finished room that we have here. The finished room, although everything looked dry, when we look at it more closely, we'll see that when you run your flashlight along the wall parallel to the surface area, that indeed the mold shows up on the wall. Still no water stains, but certainly lots of mold along the wall on the paneling. And the next photo showing our handy dandy dehumidifier. Look at the setting. It's 67% and it's running constantly. Dehumidifier is too small for that environment, not able to correct the problem. So we now know where the moisture is coming from. We know that the moisture is still present in the air because relative humidity was over 67%. We understand that there's corrective action that needs to be done. And if you only know that it needs to be done and don't know what it is, that's usually enough to help them go to the next level. We also know that there is mold present and that it does need to be remediated. So that covers the ground of what we need to do in this portion. Now, then you need to take your samples. So we go to our next section, and we'll identify here that if you're going to do testing, there are 3 standard protocols to follow. The first one is called a limited sampling. It means it's limited to a specific area, typically chosen by the client. So if you're going to do sampling and it's in 1 or 2 or 3 detailed areas called out by the client, in this case the basement, then it's limited to that basement. And so you want to use a limited agreement, and that will help protect you and also let your client know that the limit of this scope of work that you're going to do. The next one is a screening. That typically is when somebody calls and says, you know, I really don't know if I have a mold problem, or I think I have a mold problem, but I don't know where. That's when you're going to do a screening of that area of the house or screening of the entire house, looking for signs, what's called red flags or warning signs of the potential for mold. From there, you're going to take your samples and you're going to send them to the lab, and then a determination will be made based on that. The next one is going to be a survey. Now, surveys aren't done very often anymore. They used to be required by insurance companies, but most of that's gone by the wayside. Surveys are very extensive, very time-consuming, and very expensive. Let me give you an example. A standard home, about 2,000 square feet, that I did for a court case required a survey. That survey took almost 8 hours. There was a mapping of the house. There were photographs of every room and every red flag area. The red flags were put down on the map area, and there were detailed sample results from each of those areas. Then all of that is put into a report. So you can see that you're not going to be doing too many of the surveys typically unless you get involved with court cases. The other one that you may be doing is post-testing. Post-testing could be done in 2 ways. One would be straight post-testing, where after a remediation is done, you'll go in and do post-sampling. The other one is if they have to set up containment. During that case, they'll want a clearance. They'll want you to go in and make sure that you take your samples, you view the area, everything has been removed and clean, and your samples show that indeed the mold problem is resolved, clear to take your containment down, good to go. Let's look at the limited sampling and the steps involved in limited mold sampling. First one is the location to be identified by the client. Second part is review the samples that are needed to be taken with the client. Then you put it on the agreement form, review the form with the client, and have them sign off on it. From there, locate a clean workstation, sometimes kitchen counter. Sometimes if the house is a mess throughout, then you're going to be using your vehicle, so make sure your vehicle is a clean area. From there, you'll go ahead and set up your paperwork. Make sure you review everything with the client before you get started. And this is very important. When you review your agreement with the client, this is a legal binding document. You must give them time to read and review the conditions of that agreement. So what you can do is you can review the samples you want to take, give them time to review it while you're going to set up all your equipment and while you're taking your outside sample. Then you can come back in and ask them if the terms and conditions are okay for them. I hardly ever find a time where they rebuttal in any way. It's already signed usually by the time I come in, and then you can move forward with the rest of your samples. Then you're going to take your samples, and of course you're going to send them airborne to the lab. When you're doing a screening, this is the next part. You'll walk through the area that's indicated by the client, which could be the whole house, or maybe a level of the house, or an area of the house. You'll walk through the area indicated by the client, which could be one level or multiple levels, and you will mark all the red flag areas that you identify. From there, you'll review the agreement with the client, locate your clean space, set up your workstation there, take your samples, and send the samples to the lab. Survey. If you're going to do a survey, you'll be walking through the entire building, home or office building or other indoor building. Map the building out with each room. You'll be looking for your red flags, mark them, label them, take pictures, usually 3, one entering the area, the other closer to your red flag, and then one of the red flag itself. Also, it's recommended that you take photos of your sampling. Take photos when you're taking your hygrometer reading so you know what your humidity levels are. Take a picture of your moisture meter if you're putting that up against the surface, and take a picture of your machine while it's running. So you have all of this on a photo in case you ever need it. From there, review the agreement with the client, take your samples, send them to the lab airborne. And then, of course, post-testing can either be the clearance or the standard. Here's the challenge with doing a post-test. I get a call from somebody that said, we did a pre-test, remediation was completed, and now we're 6 weeks later. And someone new lives in the house, or they've now moved in the office equipment. That's way too long after remediation. It doesn't become a post-test anymore because you've opened doors and introduced new things to that space. So if you really want to call it a post-test, you need to do it closely after the time of remediation, before doors and windows are open, before people start entering that space to either do construction or other types of work. So in these standards that I've been talking about, the limited, the screening, the survey, I've talked about red flags. Let's take a look at what red flags are. That's a red flag, right? But that's not really what we're looking for. A red flag would be if you have an area of the home where mold is landing. So if you have your floor joists that come out and you have mold growing on that floor joist, that's a red flag. If you have water stains in the basement, that's a red flag. So let's take a look at what our red flags are. One is going to be visual. Visual signs that there is a potential mold issue, such as water stains, mold, fungus. 2, odor. Is there a musty odor? Now, I'm not talking about a dusty odor, and here's a common theme that happens. A client or a realtor or somebody will tell you that it's just a musty odor because the house has been closed up too long. It doesn't work that way because the odor comes off a solid. The solid are the spores. So when you get that damp, musty odor, it's mold. If you get just a dusty smell, then it's from the house just being closed up. So we need to understand the distinction between the two. So getting back to our red flags, we have odor and we have visual. The next one is history. If the owner or person giving you access, your client, to the home or building, and that building has a history of water issues, and they tell them to you, then that is a red flag. And then our last red flag is going to be health. Health concerns or health questions. You can get that from the people that reside in the area, sometimes tenants. And so that can be a warning sign to pursue it further. If you don't see anything on the surface areas and no other red flags are showing up, that's when you want to start thinking about what's beyond the surface areas, such as wall cavity samples, that type of thing, to help facilitate understanding whether there's a mold issue there or not. So let's go back to our testing and understand that, again, when we do our post sampling, we want to make sure that depending on the type of remediation that was done, that the sampling is done 1 to 3 or 4, several days after the remediation, and that can be worked out between you and the remediation company, again, depending on the type of remediation that was done. What you don't want to do is let it be prolonged 6, 8 weeks or more. Then it's no longer a post-test, it's a test. So when we go back to our testing then, and we look at other types of tests that can be done, we roll into the next slide, which identifies viability study. This is not something that's done typically during real estate transactions, and not something that I suggest you do, because it has to be done within certain parameters. In most viability studies, petri dishes that are left, you're going to find mold on it. So they're used only during certain conditions and not the type that we would do during home inspections. The next one is insurance testing. You may get a call and be asked to go out and do a sampling or testing for insurance companies. Insurance companies are going to want to know the scope of this situation. And they're going to want to make sure you do a pre-test and a post-test. So make sure you follow the guidelines that we're showing you here and the sampling techniques that will come up in the next module. We'll be able to help set you up so that you know what steps to take in the event that you're doing an insurance test. Next one is court cases. Court cases aren't very common to be doing mold testing for, but when they do occur, or if you get called in on one for one that you've done, there are 2 important details you don't want to miss. Number 1, you want to make sure you have all your paperwork in order. Every T crossed, every I dotted. You want to make sure that you have adhered to the protocols. You also want to make sure that you have pictures of the areas that you've run your test in, and that you have all the documentation with you. Working with Testall will assist with this, because we will be writing the reports for you and assisting in this process.